know that making guitars could be hazardous to your health? That's especially true if you're doing the work within your home, whether it's a workshop that's in your basement, your garage, or God forbid, your kitchen table. Now, of course, we all know that using certain power tools like table saws, band saws, drill presses, joiners and planers, they can all be hazardous, even life-threatening, if you use those tools improperly or in a way that is not recommended by the manufacturer. But there is another lesser-known factor which you need to consider that can affect your health and the health of anyone who might be living where you're building those guitars, whether it's a roommate, your spouse, kids, grandparents, anyone living in the same structure where you're doing the work to build guitars could also be exposed to some of these hazardous products. And that's kind of what I'm going to try to discuss in more detail in this video. Now, this all came about because I recently got a text from a gentleman who writes, DIY is fine, but there's a health prevention issue when people sand wood, plastic, and metal in their living space. A bedroom player is one thing. A bedroom luthier is a hazard for the whole family. Asthma and worse, much, much worse. And what he is saying is absolutely true, but it's only part of the story. There's actually more hazards than you might be aware of. Now let's talk about sanding dust, which is what that commenter mentioned. When you sand wood, you produce sanding dust, and we see that. As you're sanding, you can actually see the dust piling up on the surface that you're sanding. Sanding dust can be very hazardous to our lungs. When you breathe in the dust, it can cause a whole host of respiratory issues. It can also cause problems with allergic reactions. Some folks will develop allergic reactions to certain types of wood when they're come into contact with it, whether they touch it or breathe it in. It can cause all kinds of problems. So if you're sanding wood and somebody in your house breaks out in a rash or has some sort of issue, it could be because of the sanding dust that you're generating. Now, as you're sanding by hand, like I said, you can see that dust, but there are particles that you can't see that are floating in the air that you breathe in. And it becomes incredibly important to mitigate that dust so that it doesn't become a health hazard within your house. But when you're also using tools like the band saw, the table saw, even the joiner, planer, drill press, all those tools will also produce dust as you're using them. And you may not see it and may not realize it because in many cases those tools produce lots of wood chips. And you would think, well, the wood chips aren't going to be a hazard because you're not breathing those into your lungs. But if you use those tools, as soon as you're done using the tool, shut it off and then immediately turn off the lights in your shop and then shine a flashlight around your shop. You'll see that dust floating in the air because those tools will generate the dust as well. And it's not healthy for us to breathe that in. Now, fortunately, a healthy human respiratory system has a way of mitigating dust to a certain level. But when you're generating wood dust with these tools or by hand sanding, you're generating way too much dust for your body to deal with. And that can lead over time to all sorts of health issues with respect to your respiratory system. And as I said, in certain cases, you can develop allergic sensitivities to the wood that you're using. It doesn't happen right away for some folks. It can take time, but over time that you develop these issues that can cause problems. And it may not be you, the luthier building the guitar, that suffers these problems. It could be somebody else who's living in your home. There's also the issue of chemical exposures. A lot of the chemicals we use, whether they are adhesives or finishing products, can be extremely dangerous to our health. They produce fumes which are high in volatile organic compounds, VOCs, which can affect our respiratory systems, our central nervous systems, and can cause all kinds of problems if you don't deal with them properly. And the issue with the chemicals is even if you are wearing the right PPE, covering yourself head to toe with a Tyvek suit and respiratory protection with the right type of mask and respirators and eye protection and covering all your skin, the people who live in your home with you may not be protected. And these vapors can make their way into your home and cause problems with other people. Plus, it's important to remember, if you're building the guitar where you live, you are exposed to these chemicals, as well as the sawdust I mentioned earlier, 24 hours a day, or potentially 24 hours a day, depending on how often or how much time you spend building your guitar. But the fact that you're living, you're eating, sleeping, watching TV in the same environment where you're producing this sanding dust and chemicals means that you are exposed to it for a much longer period than a guy who goes to across town to a workshop, works for 8 hours a day building guitars, and then goes home, because they leave that exposure and they're typically at home or away from that exposure for longer periods than they are being exposed to it. Now, I don't mean to sound all doom and gloom here, because when I make these videos, I'm trying to educate and inspire you to make guitars. And this particular subject might sound like I'm trying to tell you not to even bother, because you're going to end up killing yourself trying to achieve success building guitars. But in truth, there are ways to mitigate these problems. And it has to do with dust collection and structuring your environment to minimize exposure to both the dust and the chemicals that we associate with guitar building. And with regards to eliminating the sanding dust, that can be a real challenge, because sanding dust gets everywhere and it floats in the air because it's so light in weight. So you have to follow some fairly strict procedures to dealing with it. The first and probably the most affordable way is to not sand in your house, in your garage, your basement, and God forbid, the kitchen table. Instead, sand outdoors. Now that means you're going to need to be working at a time of year when the weather is conducive to doing that. You can't be sanding outside when it's snowing and 30 degrees or less. So you need to plan out that approach and sand and build guitars when the weather permits. If you're looking to build during the winter months or when the weather isn't ideal, then you're going to need to invest in some equipment that's going to help you to mitigate the dust. And I use, in my shop, 2 different types of dust extraction. Now, what dust extraction is it's essentially a way of removing the dust from where you're working and then collecting it in a container that isn't going to allow exposure to that dust. The air that's pulled in is also filtered to remove even the smallest particles of the dust. Now, the 2 extractors that I use, the first one is a simple dust extractor which I can connect to all my tools. So with a hose, I can attach this to, for example, my joiner. I can also attach it to my planer. You'll notice with a lot of your electric tools like this random orbital sander, you have a dust port, and I have fittings that will connect this hose to my sander. And that does a great job of removing, I would say, anywhere from 75 to 80% of the dust. And it deposits all that dust material into a large 55-gallon trash can. There's also, because this is pulling air in, it's also pushing air out. That air is filtered through a bag which only allows the very tiniest of particles to escape. It can trap probably the remaining 10 to 15% of the particles, but there will still be some particles that get out of that bag because it can only filter so much. That's where the second dust extraction system comes into play. And what that is a ceiling mounted air cleaner is what it is essentially. And what it does is it literally sucks all the air in my workshop, pulls it through a filter, extracts all the particles, and then exhausts clean, fresh air. And in my garage workshop, which is basically a 2-car garage, I can filter 100% of this air in about 10 minutes. So it's constantly running when I'm working in the shop. So it's always filtering out that air. But even though I have these 2 dust extraction systems to deal with dust, and they do a great job, I still wear a mask. And I wear a mask just to get, or just to ensure that those last very tiniest particles that escape collection don't get breathed into my lungs. Now, this isn't a totally 100% perfect solution for dealing with dust. And in truth, there really isn't one, because dust it's very finicky and it's difficult to extract it all from the air. You would literally have to be working in a laboratory level environment for that to happen. And nobody does that. Nobody can afford it. Even the biggest guitar companies can't do it. So we do the best we can, and hopefully that's enough to keep the dust levels low, especially if we're doing the work in our homes. When it comes to mitigating dust when hand sanding, that takes a whole different approach. And what I've done is I've created a downdraft table. And these are easy to make, and they're based on these inserts, which you can buy from a number of different sources online. And what I'll do is I'll try to put links to some of these products that I'm talking about in the description for this video down below. But when you buy these inserts, they also come with instructions on how to make a downdraft table. And I simply connect a 4-inch hose from my dust extractor to this fitting on the back of the downdraft table. And that produces enough downdraft to pull the sanding dust away as I'm sanding on the surface. And then it runs through the dust extractor. But then I also use my ceiling mounted dust extractor to try to pick up whatever dust doesn't get picked up by the collector that's attached to the downdraft table itself. Again though, I still wear a mask when I sand. Now sometimes you've probably noticed when you've watched my videos, I'll be working, sanding, and I'm not wearing a mask. So you'll think, well, you don't even practice what you preach. I do. But when I'm making videos, I can't wear a mask and talk at the same time. So that's the reason why you'll see me not wearing a mask in my videos. But in truth, when I'm working the rest of the time, and only a small portion of my time is captured on video, I'm wearing a mask. Now, I would suggest if you're going to be building a lot of guitars, more than, just a few, if you're going to be making this a business, then I would suggest that you off-site your workshop. And that means leasing a space where you can do the work and then leave it every evening when you're done, and not have to worry about having all that dust in your workshop. Because I can tell you from experience, when you're building even just 4 or 5 guitars at a time, you're producing enormous amounts of dust. And that can be a real issue. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this video, you can show your support by clicking the thumbs up button down below. It's free to do. You can also click the subscribe button, which is also free. And when you do that, you can click the bell for notifications. That way you'll never miss any future content. But if you want to take your support to the next level, you can click the thanks button and leave a tip in the amount that you think is fair. Or you can click the join button or the subscribe plus button and become a member of my channel. And as a member, you're going to be able to enjoy videos just like the one you're watching, but with much more detail, and best of all, no ads. Now let's get back to the video. Okay, so I've talked about how to mitigate dust that we generate when we sand wood, but what about metal and plastic? Well, I don't sand a whole lot of metal, but when I do, I usually wet sand it. And that keeps the dust from becoming an issue. When it comes to plastic, however, that's kind of an interesting situation. I don't sand a lot of solid plastic itself, but when I'm level sanding and polish sanding my clear coat finishes, that is in a sense sanding plastic. And I typically use a dry sanding technique. The products that I like to use, the abrasives, are the Super Acelux sanding abrasives. And those work great when you're dry sanding. But that does produce a lot of very fine sanding dust that is basically plastic. Well, I deal with it the same way that I deal with sanding wood. I have my dust extraction systems which pull most of the dust away, and I wear a mask. So I don't think it's as big of an issue. Now, as far as chemical exposure, that's a whole different ball of wax. Now, in truth, even dust is at its root a chemical exposure. But I like to separate that from the exposure to the fumes and overspray that we typically experience when we're applying finishes to our guitars. A lot of the products that we use can contain what are known as volatile organic compounds, VOCs, and those are very hazardous to our central nervous system as well as our respiratory systems. And you must prepare and protect yourself from exposure to those chemicals. And also know that if those chemicals are present in the air around you and you're working in your home workshop, anybody who lives in that same space is going to be exposed to it as well. So it becomes critically important to mitigate that. And just like with the dust extraction, there are a couple of ways that you can mitigate it. One, to minimize the use of those products. If you're planning to be applying finishes 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, you're going to want to do it somewhere else, because that's just going to produce too much for you to really safely manage in a home workshop. Now, if you have tremendous resources, you can build spray booths and that sort of thing to help minimize, and it can actually do a pretty good job of eliminating the exposure to fumes and chemicals. However, it is expensive and it can be complicated to do it, and it takes up a lot of space. But it's really the only way that you can eliminate that. Just wearing a respirator or a mask is not going to be enough. Some of these products that we use, such as nitrocellulose lacquer and 2K polyurethanes, can be extremely hazardous, very dangerous, not only in terms of breathing those chemicals into your body or having them to absorb through your skin. They're also flammable in many cases, and a single spark can set off those fumes and burn your entire workshop down. And if your workshop's in your home, the whole home goes with it. I've seen that happen so many times. Now, you may decide, well, I'm not going to use those type of products. I'm just going to use oil finishes. Well, oil finishes have their own sources of hazardous issues. Oil-based products can cause fires. If you don't dispose of rags properly, they can spontaneously combust. And I can tell you, every time you see somebody's home burned down and a fire that started in the garage, it was either because they had an electric vehicle that had a lithium battery that caught on fire, or they threw a bunch of oil-soaked rags into a trash can and they spontaneously combusted. That happens all the time. I've known so many luthiers who lost everything because of improper disposal of rags. And all you really need to do is, after you use the rag, is to lay it out, let it fully dry. Don't pile it up with other rags, but lay it out, let it dry, and then place it into an airtight container filled with water. And that's how you dispose of it. And that'll prevent it from catching on fire. Now, as far as other products that we use for finishing, like the 2K polyurethanes and the nitrocellulose, like I said, you're going to need some kind of a spray booth. And that's where things get really complicated, because spray booths, a really good spray booth is going to have at least a couple of explosion-proof fans, one pulling air in, one exhausting air out. They have to be explosion proof when you're using some of these type of products because they're flammable. And any spark from a motor could cause the fumes to ignite, which when they ignite, it's not just a flame, it's an explosion. So you've got to use, like I said, the explosion proof fans, and you have to build the spray booth in such a way that you create negative pressure inside the spray booth so that all your overspray, everything is vented out of the spray booth. It's then filtered, and then the air that goes out of your workshop area outside is clean. So that requires careful planning, careful construction, the right kinds of parts and materials to build it, and then regular proper maintenance. And even if you don't go to that extent, if you're just going to work in a well-ventilated area and you think, well, I'm only going to do 1 or 2 guitars a year, and I'll just make sure I wear the right kind of PPE so that I don't breathe in the harmful fumes. You have to maintain everything correctly. You have to make sure your respirator has clean filters every time you use it, because they don't last very long. And once they start to get clogged up, they don't do anything. And you may be wearing this respirator thinking you're safe and everything, but in truth, it's not doing the job that it's intended to do because you haven't maintained it properly. And that's critical for ensuring the best possible performance from that type of equipment. But you should also, when you're going to use a product, find out from the manufacturer, see if they have material data safety sheets for that product. And that's going to tell you how hazardous that product is. And it's also going to tell you what you need to do to protect yourself. And in almost every case that I've ever experienced with manufacturers and their MDS sheets is that they are very conservative in their recommendations. And they're going to tell you to do a lot more than is sometimes necessary. But do it, especially if you're working in your home environment. Now, another reason why I wanted to make this video is because the other day I saw a post on Instagram from another luthier, and I'm not going to mention who this luthier is because I don't want to throw shade on him. But he posted a photograph of 2 rattle cans of lacquer, and he was talking about how much he loves this lacquer, how it's everything a good lacquer should be. But what I thought was most interesting is when I looked at the photograph, at the bottom of the can, in huge all cap letters, it said, extremely dangerous, hazardous material, poison. And I thought, well, is that what we want our lacquers to be? Is hazardous and dangerous and poisonous? That to me is kind of ironic that he would tout the benefits of this product while missing how dangerous the product actually is. When I use clear coating products and finishing products, long ago I switched from using products like nitrocellulose and 2K polyurethanes, and I started looking at using water-based products that are very low in VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And because of the demand for these type of products, the science and the chemistry behind them has matured and evolved to a very high degree and continues to do so even today. And I've recently started using Target Coatings MCAP Plus, which is a water-based 2K acrylic. Now, when you hear 2K, your first thought is, well, it uses a hardener that contains isocyanates, and that's what's so dangerous. Well, this product uses a hardener, but it doesn't contain any isocyanates. The product is very low in VOCs, and I don't want to say it's totally non-toxic, but it's very close. You still should wear a mask when you use it, but it's nowhere near as hazardous as the isocyanate containing 2K polyurethanes. And it's also non-flammable, and it's easy to clean out your spray gun when you're done using it. So when it comes to finishing products, I have made the switch over to products that are very low in toxicity. So I don't really have to worry so much about my exposure or the exposure of anyone living in my household. It's just not there. Plus, I'm using a spray booth when I spray the product anyways. So I can minimize the exposure to the fumes by extracting and filtering them. And I'm also using a low volume, low pressure spray gun, which when set up correctly yields very low overspray. So that becomes even less of an issue. But I guess in the end, what it really comes down to is how much risk are you willing to take building guitars in a home workshop? And how much risk are you willing to expose the other people who might be living on top of or next to your workshop? And is it really worth it to put yourself and everyone else at risk? Or maybe you should reconsider the whole hobby of building guitars or the business of building guitars, in which case what you would want to do if you are dead set on doing it is make sure you take the proper precautions to avoid those potential hazards. And it's important to remember, as a doctor once told me when I went in for a physical, I have bad news for you. You're going to die. We just don't know when or what's going to kill you. But eventually, we all die. And something is going to take us down. If you can control that, you should. But just know that eventually you will succumb to the realities of life on Earth. And that is, it begins, it continues, and then it ends. So I wouldn't get too worked up about what potential guitar building will have at bringing your life to a close or anybody else's life. But if you can make any effort to minimize that risk, that means you're not only going to be building guitars now, but you'll be building them when you're in your 70s and hopefully in your 80s. And that means you won the battle and you succeeded. And hopefully everyone who lives with you will also enjoy a long and fruitful life. Because there's an old saying that I hear all the time on the news when somebody dies unexpectedly. A reporter will always say, or a witness who's being interviewed will always say, oh, he or she died doing what they loved. And I've always thought that that was the most ridiculous thing you could say, because another way to look at it is what you loved murdered you. So we don't want that to happen. So I implore you to take the necessary precautions and make guitar building in your home workshop safe. At any rate, I hope you found this video to be useful and maybe thought-provoking. In the comments section below, let me know what you think about building guitars at home and what unique or interesting ways that you try to mitigate the risk of your exposure to sanding dust and the fumes and chemicals that we normally associate with guitar building. And if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. Stop what you're doing right now. Click that thumbs up button down below because it really does help the channel. And you can also do some of the things I mentioned earlier in the video to help take your support to the next level. But as always, until the next episode, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for more of these guitar building videos.